So yeah, as Kim said, thank you, Kim. This is building on a piece that I've written for Glenn for the new version of the TV genre. But I wrote it about Bake Off in the last edition, about 6 years ago, but it's gone through a few transformations since then. And this piece, that piece for the book is only about 1,200 words. So it has an ending as well. What this paper hopefully will do is take that piece and look at possible areas, avenues to explore, maybe to expand it into something else, something bigger than just a summary of the show and different elements. So I'm going to try and remember how this works. Okay. That visible? Hopefully. Oh, hang on. How to move. There we go. Okay. The other thing I should note is the title is being built on as well, so I probably should have changed the title before starting, but anyway. Okay, so in this paper, Under the Eyes of This Bread Lion, I'm going to be looking predominantly at, in the first section, on format in relation to the show, which is what my piece in the genre book is about, discussing the idea of how the format has been successful, how it's been repeated by other shows, and how that format's been exported. And then 2 avenues of possible further exploration around this programme. So, as many of you probably know, the show originally started on the BBC, on BBC Two, moving to BBC One, and is now on Channel 4. So I'm looking a little bit about how those programmes and those channel broadcaster identities can be seen possibly in the show if the show itself is adapted to the broadcaster. What's interesting as well with the BBC and Channel 4 at the moment is obviously they're both channels with clear public service broadcasting remits, and they're both under they're reliant on government favour in a lot of ways. So ideas around privatisation and funding, how that impacts on their content. The third section will look at the idea of the amateur celebrity, which Jorie Lagerwey has discussed in relation to the Bake Off, and particularly the figure of Nadiya Hussein. And the last section, which is slightly divided, is a possible avenue that I've noticed more recently, and that relationship between food television and public service broadcasting, and how those kind of connect and where they've been used, especially over the last couple of years. So I'm taking the liberty of quoting myself in that I helpfully summarised the show 6 years ago. So it's a successfully exported format, the Bake Off. In 2015, or before 2015, it had been sold to at least a dozen international markets, with each adding a local flavour to challenges that contestants were doing, as well as regional variations around presenters and judges. The American series managed to import Paul Hollywood because he has quite a Hollywoody name, which helps. And the show was interesting in that it offered a guide to British culinary identity and its relationship to historical colonial class debates and histories. And yet it's such a cosy show, it would tend to kind of overlook some of the unsavoury aspects of those. So, for instance, there used to be documentary items which would look at, say, the history of spices to the UK and the relationship in the UK, or history of sugar, and their ability to not discuss the slave trade was quite impressive. The programme also obviously brought foods from different social classes and class histories, so there'd be challenges based on building a pasty, which would then be discussed in relation to, obviously, working class industries, but also the grandeur of something like a croquembouche and its kind of more aristocratic elements. By today, the format or the series has been sold to roughly 200 territories globally, with approximately 35 countries producing their own version of the Bake Off, most of which are still going. I think 28 are still in production around the world. It was interesting this year that one of the contestants, Freya, talked in an interview after she left the series about how she and others would spend their free time watching the Kenyan version of the Bake Off, which has a very different tone, a very different attitude to the British one. It's much more relaxed than the British one. What's interesting as well with this year and last year is that the contestants have all had to live in a bubble based around COVID restrictions. So the team of presenters and the contestants seem much closer now than they were before. The Bake Off is also the BBC's third most successful format for export after Strictly Come Dancing and The Weakest Link. So for those of you, I'm sure, are familiar, and those of you who are not, every episode of the Great British Bake Off is built around a 3-challenge structure. So you would have the signature, where somebody does a recipe that they seemingly do all the time, a technical, which is built around an idea of skills and knowledge, and the showstopper, which, as the title suggests, is something more spectacular. And these, along with the fact that every episode has a winner or loser, the star baker versus the one who's sent home at the end of the competition, each episode has a very similar narrative, a very clear structure. Within that structure, the show can discuss genre in various ways. The original genre book section I wrote was under the reality TV section. And in a lot of ways, the original version of the show sort of could fit into reality TV. It was a hybrid of different elements and would bring together talent show, cookery, recipes, comedy from the presenters, Mel Gedroych and Sue Perkins, who are a comedy double act, but also we learned about the contestants. We learned about their background, and as they got further in the competition, we learned more and more about them. They were revealed to us, and in some cases that could be very emotional and allow the audience to connect with the competitors in different ways. Nadiya Hussein I'll come to later, but also a few years ago there was a contestant who, when he was sent home, talked about how the show had helped him because his wife had died earlier in the year, and it allowed him to kind of re-enter sort of more social world, reconnect with himself through that process of working through his grief. In many ways, the production has been streamlined as it's got more successful and adapted over time. So the first series, which is more of a kind of, I'm not sure they knew they or expected to get a second series. The first series was 6 episodes and moved location week by week. So it connected baking with British identity very clearly. So they would set up the marquee in different towns with baking connections. So Bakewell in Derbyshire being the most obvious one, but also Scone Palace in Perthshire, which seemed a bit tenuous. And they went, for pastry week, they went to Cornwall, which allowed them to do pasties and so on. There have been some modifications to the format over time, most notably, I mentioned earlier, the documentary inserts. So in the first few years, you would have the competitive element of the show balanced out with historical documentaries around recipes, around ingredients, but that's kind of gone as the show's been grown more successful, especially since it moved to BBC One prime time. So they've kind of taken out the bits that might be considered the boring bits and kind of concentrated far more on the contestants and their lives, which is what the audience mostly connects with. I've set up a clip. So for those of you who have not seen it, for Kim in particular, is that visible? I hope so. Okay, so I'm going to show a clip of one of the showstoppers. I think I've put the sound on, I'm not sure now. Hang on.
You'll see a video on the screen, Lisa.
Aha. Okay. I think I need to adapt. How about now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Cool. So this is a showstopper. This is what average bakers are expected to be able to do. Okay. Okay. So yesterday they had to make a Twix. It was ridiculous. But anyway. Okay. Go back. So that would be obviously the showstopper element of an episode. I think that was the first series on Channel 4. So we have this idea of repetition within the format, but with slightly different angles. It is technically, in many ways, a competitive reality show, and it's a model that's been reproduced across a lot of other content. So most notably, a program like the Great British Sewing Bee and the Great Pottery Throwdown, which are made by the same people, follow the same format. It's 3 challenges across roughly an hour of television. What's interesting at the moment, especially over the last 5 years, potentially based on the success of the Bake Off, is this development of a competitive reality show built around the domestic skills, so domestic labour, in many ways. Realise I haven't done that. So we have more and more programmes that are based on domestic situations, domestic skill bases, crafts, hobbies, talents, not just your usual sort of singing and dancing situations. And these tend to form very comforting and very cozy content. So we have people doing things which they would normally do for relaxation, such as baking or sewing or pottery or art. There's a new show about woodwork that's recently come out, and broader forms of cookery. So once the BBC lost Bake Off to Channel 4, it produced the Best Home Baker talent show to replace it with Mary Berry, usefully. The possible influence of this of Bake Off on other programmes, the success of the format, is potentially linked to its viewing figures. When it started off on BBC Two in 2010, it usually averaged 2 million viewers, maybe 3 on a good week. By the end of Series 3 on BBC Two, the viewing figures peaked at 7.2 million, which for BBC Two is quite extraordinary. The opening episode for Series 4, also on BBC Two, was even higher, and the final episode of Season 4 got over 9 million viewers. In 2015, when it moved to BBC One, the top 10 audience ratings across the channel for the entire year was predominantly made up of episodes of Bake Off. The final, which was on by Nadiya Hussein, was watched by over 15 million, which I think, as I said in my abstract for this session, most drama shows would cut off their right leg if they had one for that kind of viewing number. And they went up again the next year. When it moved to Channel 4, it was the first series on Channel 4 had the highest viewership for Channel 4 since the opening ceremony of the Paralympics in 2012. And in 2020, the final was watched by 11.5 million viewers, which again for Channel 4 is quite extraordinary numbers. There have been modifications to format. I've mentioned this slightly already, but as the show moves channels and grows in success and grows in popularity, the focus of the show is much more on the competitors than it was in the early years. The early years tried to bring together so many different elements. that sometimes the contestants got left out in order to do the comedy skits and the documentary inserts. But the focus on the contestants has gotten stronger and stronger as it's gone on. Also, across this time, in order to connect more with audiences, weekly themes have started to push the boundaries of what the contestants can do. For example, this year, just in an early week, they had to create a cake that defied gravity, or at least seemed to, which is not what your average home cook does. But also opens up debates around contemporary food culture. So they have theme weeks linked to contemporary food issues. So you have more content based on vegan cooking or dairy-free, gluten-free cooking, reflecting what the contemporary debates are. Other theme weeks have kind of tried to broaden out what the challenges are, so it's not repetitive year by year. So they've done German week, Victorian week, Tudor week, which was a bit of a stretch. And yeah, the more dietary requirement ones. So this is the, I think, final sentence from the new version of the Bit for the Bake Off, not the Bake Off, for the genre book, sorry. Since its initial inception, the basic format may be consistent, but its development and increasing viability for A-list brand association in association with programs' seemingly egalitarian ideals is arguably unique. What's changed with the show in many ways is how it's adapting to different channels and how it's adapting to debates around what successful TV has to do. There have been changes that the show developed based predominantly around broadcaster, but also hosts of the show. But also recently more how it's adapted to COVID, as well as the rest of TV production. How they've adapted to COVID is one of the things that we see most obviously as audiences. So variations on the format as well. Why have one show when you can have 6 or 7? The success of the programme, as it's grown since 2010, has led to inevitable spin-offs. The chemistry amongst the presenters and the judges led to Mary Berry and Paul Hollywood, the original judges, doing their own cookery shows. Their profiles on television have escalated as following on from the success of this. So Mary Berry, for instance, has returned to television as a conventional TV food presenter again, having had, I think, a couple of decades off from that. So she now has a fairly regular BBC Two cookery show. Paul Hollywood has become a TV personality after only making occasional appearances before that, looking often programmes fixed specifically on baking based on his background. In the original host team, Mel and Sue returned to television as a comedy double act, having built up a profile on Channel 4 in the late 90s with programmes like Light Lunch. They suddenly had a sort of upswing in their presence. As the new presenters on Channel 4, Sandy Toksvig and Noel Fielding became, again, more prime time. Noel Fielding is much more sort of cult comedy figure. His casting was controversial, to say the least, whereas Sandy Toksvig was at the time working with Channel 4 a bit more. The increase in Prue Leith's profile as well. The current co-host, Matt Lucas, is arguably the biggest star that's been brought onto the show. But again, he seems to be working. So through these extra programs, you're not only seeing the format, but also the hosts kind of diversifying a lot more. We see them having to deal with audiences of different groups, the introduction of the professionals. Competition brings in that slightly more restaurant element. So Bake Off the Professionals is much more in line with something like MasterChef or Great British Menu, in that we have professional chefs working in the same sort of format structure. Junior Bake Off, which is adorable, which is essentially a selection of competitors under the age of 15, some of them as young as 8, taking part in competition. It started off on CBBC, the BBC's children's television channel, and has moved to Channel 4 with everything else. What's interesting with Junior Bake Off is how previous contestants have come back as judges for the kids, and also the connection more with the broadcaster's identity comes across in the charity specials. So the link between a successful program for the broadcaster linked with that broadcaster's specific charity telethon type content. So on the BBC, Bake Off was incorporated into the programming around sports relief and comic relief, and is now part of the programming around Channel 4's charity show Stand Up to Cancer. Another interesting element, another interesting variation are the festive specials that have come along with Channel 4's tenure on the show. At Christmas, predominantly. It does lead to, obviously, themed episodes. Everyone's doing Christmas puddings or mince pies or whatever it happens to be. And it creates this, again, even warmer, more nostalgic view of baking as part of British identity. But more importantly, it allows the show to link with its own history. So the Christmas specials that happen on Channel 4 allow for a connection across the show's history as past contestants come together for theme episodes. And we can see the competitors from the BBC years and the Channel 4 years mixing together, which kind of removes that idea of animosity after the show kind of got bought out and moved to a different channel. So Bake Off is kind of the leader in what might be termed nice reality television, nice TV shows, nice competitions. And it has had this kind of influence on other cosy, nice, comfortable, reassuring content, reassuring programs based around, again, domestic activities such as baking or sewing and so on. The reality label is inevitably very broad, and the status of Bake Off as reality is possibly less clear now than it was originally. We do meet the contestants, we learn about their lives, we learn about their families, we learn about their friendships within the group, especially in the COVID years. The hybrid nature of this programme also brings a new dynamic to cooking shows, but also to talent shows and to general competitions on TV. It's by mixing together those three elements, it creates something quite special, quite. It's very hard to pin down as well. The definition of its genre it gets harder to pin down as it goes on, really. It's been nominated for various awards over the years, but it's been categorised as a challenge show, as factual entertainment, or as a competition series, depending on which award ceremony you look at. It also won a Rose d'Or for lifestyle. And in many ways, yes, it is a lifestyle programme. It's very middle class, but it has that aspirational, friendly element. You can see other programmes which are very successful at the moment following in Bake Off's footsteps. Things such as the repair shop, where people bring in heirlooms or items from the family home that are broken or torn and get them repaired in order to symbolise often a relationship with a parent or a grandparent. But other shows like Your Homemade Perfect, Glow Up, also have this kind of reassuring community feel to them, but also learning about people's lives and not judging them, but trying to help them in many ways. Lagerwey also, I think, refers to as sort of nice reality Channel 4 programs like Gogglebox and First Dates, where there is no sort of sense of animosity. You are seeing people comfortable, you are seeing people trying to get along, you see people connecting with each other emotionally. The look of the show is interesting and quite, again, adds to this kind of nice, comforting vibe. The aesthetic of the show, the set, the giant marquee, is all very nostalgic. the concept of the tent was originally based on a village fete that would show up in a different town and kind of have that slightly celebratory, festive feeling to it. The set, as you probably saw in the clip, is sort of filled with soft pastels, aspirational kitchen appliances, and Union Jack bunting, just to reaffirm that kind of Britishness idea. Whilst the contestants offer a diverse representation of Britishness, it is also kind of uniting people together as a community. There is a clear community between the competitors. I may be wrong as well. It may be a political step, but I think possibly the number of Europeans who live in the UK appearing in the show, the percentage of Europeans seems to have gone up since 2016. I don't know if that's a conscious choice, if I'm just reading too much into it. The community is very diverse. It's from different backgrounds, different classes, different ethnicities, and different professions. So the clip I just showed you, that series featured a range of professions and ages, from a 19-year-old drama student to a research scientist to an ex-army officer who possibly had the best line in the series when someone asked her if she was feeling under pressure during a task. She replied, "I've been shot at by the Taliban, this isn't pressure." Unlike other sort of reality TV or other sort of competitive shows, Bake Off is notable for the sense of camaraderie and support amongst the competitors rather than rivalries. The weeks or the months they spent taking part in the series, initially over weekend shoots where the competitors went to work during the week, and at the weekends they went off to do the Bake Off and then go home again. This clearly built relationships. In the 2020 and 2021 seasons, this extends to the crew and the presenters and the competitors. They've had to kind of create these COVID bubbles at the hotel spa resort where the tent is set up in the grounds, but not being able to leave. So they sort of have created a social bubble for themselves. So in all their free time, they're still hanging out together and playing, card games and sort of doing karaoke and watching movies together in the evenings. So the shoot during the COVID years has been more compact, but everyone is essentially living together for weeks and away from their families. The egalitarian, I keep coming back to the term egalitarian when I think about this program, also connects with how the series celebrates everyone, not just the winner at the end of the show. At the end of the series, after the winner gets their trophy and makes a little speech, just for the closing titles, there's normally a summary of what everyone's done since they left the tent. So each contestant, whether they went out week 1 or week 4 or right at the end, made it to the final, their achievements, whatever they may be, are celebrated equally. So they may have, gotten better at making bread, or they may have gone on holiday with a couple of other people from the show, but they're all deemed to be equal. So yeah, as I've already noted, the production company that makes Bake Off also makes the Great British Sewing Bee and the Great Pottery Throwdown, which have also had slightly mixed histories and moved from the BBC to Channel 4 in different ways. And also, building on the success of Bake Off, they've kind of changed their presenting teams. So the Great British Sewing Bee was, I think, originally hosted by Claudia Winkleman, but when it came back in 2020, it was hosted by Jo Lycett, who is a very different presence, a very different tone, much more surreal in humour, much less conventional as a presenter. So there's been an inevitable impact on reality shows. If the most successful competitive reality show is also the nicest, it kind of has almost led to this spread of support and camaraderie and nostalgia and tone across the genre itself. Okay. So we now go into the nice like tangents. So the bit for the genre book is it's more concise than it just was, but discusses the show in relation to its format and its impact. And two of the areas that I found to be most interesting when researching around the break-off is this concept of the broadcaster, the identity of the broadcaster, but also this connection to public service broadcasting in relation to the BBC and Channel 4 in particular. So we're kind of used to the BBC and Channel 4 in the UK at least, and it does kind of create an expectation of what you're going to see. So the BBC, we're used to it being this public service idea with educational elements, and the Bake Off moving from the slightly sidelined BBC Two up to the mainstream of BBC One and how it's changed. Channel 4, the channel that outbid the BBC when the contract came up for renewal, which is again public service, but with a minority remit. So the public service is very specific to a minority idea. It's also made up, a lot of the productions are made up from independent content providers, as well as the stuff made itself. Nobody really, I think everyone was slightly shocked when Channel 4 kind of outbid the BBC, and they outbid them by a lot when it moved across. I think the BBC was offering 15 million a year for a 3-year deal, and they were outbid by Channel 4, who offered 25 million a year when it happened in 2016. The BBC does apparently hold global distribution rights, and yet Channel 4 coming in does inevitably have an impact. There was a lot of people who refused to watch the new version on Channel 4, despite the fact that it's not that different. The third element is, of course, the production company that makes it, Love Productions. Established in 2004 by Richard McCarrow and Anna Beattie, it is notably a subsidiary of Sky, or has been since 2020. So it's kind of going to be interesting when contract renewal comes up again, as the show has continued to succeed, whether a terrestrial channel will get anywhere near it. Love Productions also is known for making factual and documentaries, but also the Sewing Bee and Pottery Throwdown, plus all of the spin-off shows. And I keep coming back to the idea of these broadcasters as public service broadcasters. The role of public service broadcasting in British television is both a formative foundational fixture and for some an obstacle to their full commercial potential. And obviously the BBC has this almost motto, which is occasionally still whispered about, to inform, educate and entertain. These two terms have obviously evolved a bit since John Reith's day, but are still referred to as crucial elements of production. The public service nature of the BBC has come into question several times, and Daniel Bilterijs talks in his article about the concept of trust, particularly after the Hutton reports, the Hutton inquiry of 2003, where there was a judicial inquiry set up by the Labour government into the death of Dr. David Kelly, an expert in biological warfare and former weapons inspector in Iraq, and he was named as a source by a BBC journalist when they were doing coverage about the war in Iraq. And Dr. David Kelly, unfortunately, then took his own life, and they were trying to work out the responsibility of the BBC in that. And its impact on trust in the broadcaster comes into play. The trust in the BBC to do the right thing, the trust of the audience in the institution in order to sort of keep with it and support it. What's interesting is post-Hutton, the BBC put out a document that reaffirmed its core values. So on top of inform, educate and entertain, The values of impartiality, independence, quality, diversity, integrity, truth, and accuracy were restated by them. The Bake Off is an interesting show in relation to debates around what public service broadcasting can be, as you can track its journey from its original form, which was very much built in with this inform, educate, entertain element, from learning about food cultures, learning about the history, educating people about the history of British cuisine and British ingredients, but also the entertainment factor and how that was impacted as it got more and more successful. When it moved to Channel 4, the BBC has also faced numerous challenges in the 21st century after the whole Hutton thing. In the practical everyday, in that it has to produce more and more content from more and more platforms and channels, but also maintain its identity, maintain its ethos, and not sort of overstretch its own budget, which makes it quite difficult. Lost my place. In contrast, Channel 4 is known for its minority remit in a lot of ways. It spent almost 40 years fulfilling a remit to produce content for audiences overlooked by other commercial broadcasters. Mainstream successes have often been linked with challenges to socially accepted ideas. It's often sort of taken in more challenging ideas, and when they've worked very well. When they haven't worked, it's been slightly more disastrous. But it has used popular formats in order to push boundaries. What's interesting in 2020 is this quote from Channel 4's annual report. "We are here to challenge groupthink and hold power to account. We don't challenge for the sake of it. We are here to test boundaries and challenge conventions to inspire reflection and critical thought." So the remit of Channel 4 was defined by the 1980 Broadcasting Act as offering an alternative, providing for tastes and interests not covered by ITV. Moving through the 80s and 90s, this became slightly difficult. Obviously, Channel 4 is a commercial channel and has often had to sort of battle against the other commercial channels for attention and funding, which Georgina Bourne discusses here. So there's this balancing act that Channel 4 has to do in order to kind of keep its minority remit, but also produce successful popular programming. In this contemporary climate, and specifically in the digital era, and as that's gone on, the challenge from streaming platforms has gotten bigger and bigger. It's finding the need to have valuable programming, successful programming, in order to keep itself as a player. However, it's still also defining itself as this challenger to norms, challenger to accepted ideas. And that the promotion around Channel 4 over the last 5 years in particular has been very confrontational. It's been doing self-promotion around itself being risky and different and willing to offend. More recently, these kind of adverts, which are essentially coming from a position of come and have a go, if you want to take us down, can be seen against this threat of privatisation that's come up recently. The idea of private ownership coming in to change the funding model that Channel 4 uses in order to maximise profits, Channel 4 would inevitably lose a lot of what makes it distinctive. So Channel 4's chairman said this in an article from about 6 weeks ago. Public service content such as the Paralympics and news and current affairs, arguably some of the stuff that Channel 4 does best, would be under threat. if private ownership came in. It would also be a threat to independent production companies, with roughly 200 independent production companies having contracts with Channel 4 at the moment. The vast majority of them would be under threat, as so many of them are dependent on Channel 4 funding. It's argued as well that if Channel 4 becomes privatised, any potential new owner could cut the channel's budget quite significantly. So the idea of where they find value, what can be used to sort of reinforce the channel's identity and success, comes into question. So its purchase of the Bake Off, arguably one of the most valuable properties in British TV at the moment, is an interesting one. But whether or not the Bake Off has become more Channel 4 is hard to pin down. Arguably, it's very similar. The tent, the format, the productions, style is consistent. Its engagement with audiences has possibly escalated through the use of social media, but arguably so is everything else. The need to have, a YouTube channel, the need to be on all the different social media platforms is for dramas as well as factual or reality shows. The representation of contemporary British identity, which arguably could connect with that idea of minority remit in Channel 4, hasn't necessarily developed much either, but it's always been very broad anyway. So that idea of Britain being a combination of different ethnicities, different heritages, different backgrounds, different religions, has often been a fairly consistent element. Arguably, the way the show has changed the most is the use of sponsorship, inevitably. The move to commercial involves commercials. But even here, it's quite interesting how sponsorship is used. So in 2012, the BBC got into trouble because it was using obviously branded kitchen appliances, and they got into trouble for essentially giving Smeg fridges an advert in a very successful show. So they had to take the branding off most of the appliances. Since moving to Channel 4, it's had official sponsorship, so little adverts for the product or the company sponsoring the show appear in and out of each section of the programme. What's interesting is how they've changed. The first series on Channel 4, it was co-sponsored by two baking-related brands, Lyle's Golden Syrup and Dr. Oetker, which I probably mispronounce. In 2018, the sponsorship was taken over by Amazon, arguably one of the biggest companies in the world. So this association with Bake Off as this valuable property and a major brand or global powerhouse of a brand is quite notable. But in 2020, it moved sort of somewhere else entirely. The shift to being sponsored by Aldi as a less prestigious, if you will, supermarket does connect with the Bake Off audience. It connects with that idea of families. It connects with the current climate around income and what you can and can't afford to buy. It is also an interesting contrast, as many other food shows on Channel 4 in the last 2 years have been sponsored by Waitrose. So it's interesting how that kind of sponsor creates a connection with the identity of the show, the identity of the audience. Trying to move quickly. The third section, this concept of the amateur celebrity, is interesting. Lagerwey has discussed this quite extensively in relation to Bake Off. And the idea of the amateur celebrity connects well with competitors in reality TV shows. The amateur nature of the contestants is often put into contrast with the professional expertise status of the hosts. So the main categories, as stated by Lagerwey here, the amateur is a non-professional. They have a love of the labour or the skill that they are enacting in the show. They receive a relative moderate level of fame and create an emotional connection with viewers. And arguably one of the most successful winners of the show is Nadiya Hussein. Winning Series 6 in 2015, Nadiya is definitely the most successful person to ever come out of this show. She is now a fixture on food television in Britain on BBC Two. She produces cooking books. Lagerwey here discusses her as a happy post-colonial subject, living a seamlessly multicultural life. It's an interesting figure. It's an interesting response, and it's inevitable that we in Britain in the 21st century, that connection with diversity, with equality, and moral panics around Islam in particular, we have a positive Muslim English woman taking on board a lot of audience affection, but also becoming very symbolic in her own right. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but I just love this picture because it contrasts Nadiya's face and her wearing the headscarf with the very ginghamy nature of the tablecloth and the fine patisserie of the thing behind her, of the cakes she has produced, the pastries she's produced. Nadiya Hussein is an interesting mixture. She's from a Bangladeshi family, but born in Luton, and her relationship with food and cooking is mixed. She has a family connection, obviously what was cooked at home, but her relationship to baking is entirely contextualised by her Britishness. She learnt baking at school. Bangladeshi cooking doesn't really bake anything. Puddings are not really an element. So all of this she learned from a teacher. She learnt in sort of her GCSE food tech, or whatever it was called. She talks constantly about the influence of her family. Her father owned a restaurant. Her mother only used the hob and used the oven in their house for storage. But also she talks about the importance of her children and her husband and how she cooks for them. Her own cooking shows that have come since have often fixed on that idea of taking something very conventional, very British, and sort of adapting it with her own taste, her own palate, and her own background. She has now become also an interesting personality on the BBC. She stands out in British food cooking shows because she's on BBC Two, somewhere between Mary Berry and Nigella Lawson, both very fixed, established figures. And the programmes that Nadiya does are very similar. They're very similar in content, but the aesthetic of them is much more family orientated, whereas Mary Berry is country kitchen, Nigella Lawson is urban sophistication. Nadiya's is, I have 3 kids under the age of 13. I need to cook for them quickly, otherwise they'll rebel. Her role as a wife and mother is also something that comes up. It's a marker of her persona when she was on the Bake Off, but also subsequently. And that idea of traditional female roles of wife and mother has been discussed in relation to other figures. Matwick's analysis of Reed Drummond, star of the US series The Pioneer Woman, who is often very self-deprecating and is placed in the role of embarrassing mom in the sort of inserts in the show when she's with her family. And Jessica Martin's analysis of food blogger Jack Monroe, who has a very mixed image. She's a single parent, she's queer, she has all of these different elements to her personality and is very symbolic of something else. And she got famous for writing about the difficulty of feeding her child through the benefit system when she had to give up work because she couldn't afford childcare. So it's interesting how the wife and mother figure, which embodies Hussein, Jack Monroe, but also Mary Berry and Nigella Lawson, is inevitably associated with female TV cooks, but also the variety within that is an interesting area to explore. So final slide. getting a bit jammed up. What I'm interested in seeing is whether the debates around Bake Off in particular can connect to wider debates, particularly in relation to the individuals involved, that sense of ordinariness of competitors in a TV talent competition versus contemporary debates around food, be it activism around diet, or preserving sort of local produce and so on, the work of people like Jamie Oliver and Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, but also that connection with normal people. Nadiya Hussein has been active in her discussion around a lot of issues, but primarily those around mental health rather than food culture. So she has a platform now where she can talk about her own struggles with mental health when she was growing up, but also kind of spread that out through her now celebrity status. There are a lot of developments in representation. So how cooking is presented to us, who is doing the cooking, the division between, often down gender lines, between home cooking and restaurant cooking. Shows hosted by chefs, they're predominantly male. And finally, an interesting area in that kind of bringing together the idea of public service broadcasting and food television in particular is, especially recently, connected to documentaries about food production and diet. So looking at what goes into mass production of different food types, but also not just how we eat, but what we eat and why. And over the last year, throughout lockdown, the public service broadcasting element has come in. The BBC during lockdown did an awful lot of work to kind of help people, so that even if it was down to putting additional content to help school kids study for exams, but also around how to cope. So lockdown cooking. There was Saturday Kitchen, which is a regular format, was brought into this kind of lockdown content production element. And there was during the dark days of lockdown, the Saturday Kitchen studio and host were utilised on a daily basis to kind of offer advice and tips around how to cook on a budget. What happens if you go to the supermarket and they haven't got any flour? And again, Jack Monroe, who was named as an austerity cook, was brought in to offer tips about what you can do, what interesting food you can make with minimal funds, with minimal ingredients. So that kind of, I don't want to say blitz spirit, but that kind of uniting the country in a kind of the same struggle became part of the production. The food television was part of that cycle of production, which is quite interesting. And also because it was on the other day, Celebration Kitchen, this kind of cultural education through food TV. Saturday Kitchen again have started doing specials around festive or celebratory occasions outside the Christian remit. So Passover, and also over this weekend for Diwali, which is I think tomorrow, a cookery program which introduces the British public to these festivals, these celebrations, and the family food culture around them. So it's interesting how that can come into play as a kind of cultural representation, which possibly wasn't there before. So, yeah, in a very muddled way, I started out this research paper before I wrote it with a sense of certainty, and now I have half a dozen questions about where it could go next. So I'm going to stop sharing now, because I feel I've been rabbiting on for far too long.